Great. Well, I'm really, really glad to be able to talk to you about a personal story of bringing nature to my own backyard. I currently serve on the board of directors of Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, and I'm just so excited to learn from all of you, speakers and non-speakers alike, of your stories, your interests in this area, and there's just so many stories to be told. And the one that I'm going to be telling you about is how, in my own backyard, we brought biodiversity back from the brink. And it was a challenge, but it was doable, and we have reaped the rewards. So, bringing biodiversity to our own backyards, and by the way, to our daily decision making, which I will be talking about toward the end. So here's the story of how we came, my husband and I came to find a piece of property and bring nature back to it. We were living in Boston in a high-rise apartment building in 1997, the end of 1997, when the apartment complex was going condo with a few of the units, and we were among the lucky ones that we were going to have our apartment turned condo. So we had to find another place to live, and this was in December, which is pretty tough to find a house, which we were looking for, and we decided to look west of Boston in the Concord, Lexington, Acton, Lincoln, Sudbury area, because we wanted proximity to Boston, and we wanted to have, hopefully, some nature, a stark contrast from our Boston existence. And so we did the usual tour, working with a realtor to find a property. And we were looking for something that was small, because we believed in small is beautiful. We didn't want a large house. We wanted a small house and a large yard where we could have nature. So the realtor took from that region, one realtor from that region took us on a tour, and me in particular one day by myself, and she had an idea of a house that we might like, and I was brought to it on Williams Road in Concord, and when I looked at the house, I didn't really think much about the house. I wasn't focused on that. I was so taken by the property, and at the time when we first arrived there, it was really the only way to describe it, a golf course. It was grass, beautifully manicured green grass from end to end. But in the midst of all this, around the edges, there was nature. There was 25 acres of conservation land, which the property backed up to, a beautiful brook running alongside the property, wonderful trees, and it was really, I think, had a lot of potential, and I saw that. So in talking with the realtor about it, I said, you know, this is just wonderful. I can see the possibilities here of bringing nature back to this property. I think we're going to buy this house. And she turned to me and she said, would you like to see the house? And I really was so taken by the possibilities that the house was just not an issue, which is particularly amazing in that I had told my husband that I no way would ever agree to a split-level home or a raised ranch. There were other styles that I'd like, but those are the two I'd not agree to. This was a raised ranch. Didn't matter. The potential was there to bring nature back, and that was our priority. So we started a process of transformation for the land, and essentially we were bringing it from a golfer's dream to a thriving metropolis of nature. I'm going to go through the different pieces of that transformation. The first was to pull up the lawn, which was the entire acre, and to make that into as much wild as we could. So we removed the lawn over 3/4 of the land, and we pulled out ornamentals everywhere. Thankfully, the former owners did not come back and visit after we moved in, because they would have been appalled by what we had done to what they had done to the yard. And so that was the first step. The next step was to remove the invasives, which turned out to be a monumental task. We had bittersweet and buckthorn growing everywhere, and there was a wall about 50 feet high in the back of the property that was between our land and the conservation land, which was now beaver swamp. And we couldn't see that. We had to remove that over a period of 3 or 4 years in partnership with the town conservation commission, the Natural Resource Commission. So we worked with them, and we had the right people come who were familiar with invasive removal. And it was quite a task to literally chop it down and get it to a level where we could pull and hand pull and remove the bittersweet. And over a period of, say, 3 or 4 years, we were able to remove this giant, thick wall of bittersweet. And we also went around and pulled all the buckthorn out that we could. And with those gone, we started reintroducing native species that had formerly been there, we realized, or thought, because we knew what kinds of habitats existed, which was the wetland, the riverine habitat, the woodland, and even meadow. So we started reintroducing natives. We worked a lot with the New England Wildflower Society, and we worked very hard to bring back food, cover, nesting, breeding, and overwintering sites. And that was a project to plan where the plantings would go, and making sure that we didn't take up what one might think is debris, fallen logs, leave those in place, create habitat for the wildlife. We had a well, which we continued to use now. It's abundant water that we use for watering, so we're not wasting water. We're not using the town water. It's cycling back into the ground, and we're using it again for watering purposes. And we started composting. We eliminated the use of any chemicals, so there were no chemical fertilizers or pesticides. And overall, our goals were a biodiverse, intact, and healthy ecosystem on our acre. And as Jim Laurie would say, we started to see that it would become self-organizing and self-sustaining over time. So this made my husband very happy, because he wouldn't have to mow the lawn, the whole acre. We reserved just a 1/4 acre that we would maintain as lawn. So here is a good picture of the backyard. This photo was taken from the deck of which is over the garage of our house, overlooking. This is in present time. This is last summer, taken by Jim Laurie. And so you can see, I don't have a before picture that I could find for this conference, but I know I have them. I'm going to find them so I can show the difference between the golf course look and this. But this really represents the transformation that we achieved by what we did. And it really is amazing what we were able to bring back in a very short time. So I think it's true that nature wants to heal. It's sort of lying in wait. And when we did what we needed to do to help it along, it just came back in very, very quick amount of time. Now, behind the property, from the last photo in the back, there was what used to be, actually, I should go back and just show you that. In the very back was where the bittersweet was. And we removed that so you can see the swamp, the 25-acre conservation land, beaver swamp in the back. And this is the view from the beaver dam overlooking the swamp with the beaver lodge there. So we were now able to see that beautiful nature that had once been blocked by the wall of bittersweet. And moving to the left of the pond that you saw in the first photo, this is getting toward the dam, which you can see right here in the background. But on this left side, there's what we call the lower swamp. You see, the beavers were very active in the swamp, and we had a beaver consultant come out and look at additional dams that had been built below this one that you can see in the picture. There were 4 of them, and the beaver consultant said, "Well, I've seen it before, there's no doubt in my mind." And I said, What are you talking about? This is a classic example of compulsive dam building behavior. So we had 3 or 4 additional dams below this one, which created what we call the lower swamp, where it once was a brook. But that's what the beavers wanted, and we kind of just went along. And here's another view of that dam and that lower swamp. And this was coming down edge of the property where the brook used to be, now a swamp, with other dams. That's a second dam that you can see with the fallen tree there, and behind that is a lot of engineering that went on by the beavers to build that dam. And again, coming down more toward the house is more of the lower swamp. And you can see the nature that had come back right along that brook. So the riparian area was restored with a lot of wonderful growth of wildflowers and native plants, with some invasives that we have to maintain, and have done a great job of that. So the natives have really started to take over. So what we are blessed with is really a confluence of habitats. We have the beaver swamp, the pond right in our yard. We have what used to be the brook, now the lower swamp. We have woodland with very tall trees, very large old growth pine, and we have meadow. So when you have a confluence of habitats, that means you have the potential for a great diversity of species, and that's exactly what we've experienced. This is just looking up into the canopy of some of the tall trees, the tall pines. And here's some examples of the meadow flowers that we planted and are now able to enjoy. But I have to say, we learned something from our meadow planting, that if you just spread the seed, the flowers are going to come up in the first year, maybe the second, but they're going to start to dwindle unless you keep seeding. But there's something underlying that failure, which I learned from Francis Clark, a botanist in our area, that you have to, if you want to do it right, you have to build the grassland. The underlying soil has to be restored, and you have to put the native grasses back. And if you have the native grasses back, then you have a greater chance of sustaining the meadow flowers, the native meadow flowers. They need each other. So we've learned that, and we're now doing a lot of planting of the native grasses to try to bring them back. So our lesson learned is that if you unbuild it, carbon, water, and nutrient cycles can begin to restore. And this is what we've definitely had happen in our yard. We've seen photosynthesis certainly come back in abundance with the greater diversity of species. We've restored the small water cycles with the help of the beavers, so that we have the local water cycle working in full force to keep our land moist and replenish the water in the groundwater. And we have a free flow of nutrients. All of this is working much better than certainly with the monocultural lawn that was once there. So if you unbuild it, they will come. Many species in each of the groups that are listed here have reclaimed former habitat in our yard. Many native plants and wildflowers, birds of all kinds. We have the passerines, the songbirds, the hawks and owls, waterfowl, many different species. Mammals, we have river otter, weasel, muskrat, and bobcat. I was amazed to learn. And everything else that you might expect, certainly the deer and woodchuck, which we've learned to coexist with. We have many reptiles, different species of snake that are associated with this kind these kinds of habitats, amphibians galore, many species of frogs. We've got the gray tree frog, the wood frog, spring peeper, green bullfrog, and American toad. And insects, one of the most amazing things was to see the dragonflies and the butterflies come back. And one of my favorites, the hummingbird moth, which now visits our garden beds, which are located at the back of the house, and those are all native plants, native flowers that we've planted with the help of the New England Wildflower Society. And here's the special treat that we enjoyed, was seeing this. Does anyone know what this is a sign of? Anybody? What's that? It's a freshwater mussel, but what eats them? Muskrat. River otter, perhaps muskrat, but river otter definitely. We have an abundance of river otter that are feasting, especially during the winter. We see that they feast on these, and so that was a wonderful sign to see them return to this area. And this is probably the most important reason we did what we did. This is my youngest daughter, Grace, and she, in this photo, has got her her supplies for looking at nature. And this is work she's done in this past week preparing for a science fair tomorrow, where she's going to be showing what she's found in our backyard through exploration of all the different habitats. And there's really no better reason to do the kind of work we've done in our yard than to make it a healthy environment for our children, but also to try to be an example for others who want to follow, because it's certainly something that can help to restore the environment and reclaim what once was. And it's also something that can be an example to others in many ways for a healthier environment, as well as reducing the labor that you have to spend to maintain a pristine monocultural property. So I want to now just see where I think this all connects with climate change and the loss of biodiversity that we're seeing. There's just two things that we all must do, only two. So listen up to see how you can fit in with this. With climate change and the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity combining as twin forces driving a paradigm shift in the relationship of humans with planet Earth, it seems that people and institutions have two primary tasks to undertake. One is to mobilize the power of biology to restore the Earth and reverse climate change. And secondly, to promote and practice a new paradigm for public and private decision-making that front-loads biodiversity and ecosystem considerations. Imagine, for example, if Monsanto, when it was developing its chemicals, pesticides, particularly the recent Roundup-Ready corn, if it had considered the biodiversity impacts, the ecosystem impacts of that decision, there may not have been that chemical developed, that genetic alteration and the use of Roundup so heavily across the Midwest. And if that had not happened, we wouldn't have seen the monarchs plummet in population. So that's just one example. I call this new decision-making paradigm that I want you all to consider biodiversity and ecosystem-based decision-making. Pope Francis, in his recent encyclical, called this integral ecology. And here's his definition of integral ecology: a vision for the world founded fundamentally on respect for nature and a renewed emphasis on our mutual interconnection with one another and with nature in all its complexity. I want to suggest that unless and until we prevent problems by considering upfront biodiversity and ecosystem health considerations in all our decision-making, we can never really achieve sustainability. All decision-making includes what I've listed here, and I'm sure other things, but in particular, I want to highlight the goods that we choose to manufacture, how and what resources we manufacture them with, the food we choose to consume, and what, how, and with what resources we produce that food, our consumption purchasing decisions, which is huge. It's really the ultimate driver of many of our environmental problems. The size homes we buy, whether and how we landscape, the goods we choose to consume, how we dispose of goods after their useful life, our investments. The laws and regulations, appropriations, and programs and policies of our government agencies. The mission, goals, and objectives and financing decisions made in corporate and nonprofit boardrooms. And the list goes on. So true sustainability for the planet and sustainability for the human species requires a biodiverse and healthy nature, period. I think I'll say instead, exclamation point. Hence the imperative to front-load consideration of these in decision-making. The time is ripe now to show the world the power and practice of biology to restore the Earth and reverse climate change, and the power and practice of biodiversity and ecosystem-based decision-making to sustain the Earth and human existence. And with any luck, as I conclude here, we are all seeing the beginning of a new story unfolding, a story of hope and promise for Earth like we've never known. And I invite you all to think about this whole paradigm shift and how we might accomplish it, and how do you think that you can change your decision-making? How can we influence others to change theirs so that biodiversity and ecosystems are a first consideration? Thank you.